Hi, welcome to Rules Challenge. My name's Carter Maxwell, and in this episode we're going to be taking a look at the game Maria. Now, Maria came out in, I think, 2009, just a couple of years after I had gotten into the hobby, and it's always been pretty special to me. I have no intention of turning this into a review channel, but I think it's fair to mention that this is my top-rated game. So there was never any question that I would someday do a rules challenge for this game. The question was just when, because there were some years, I went several years actually without playing it, but it's been hitting the table for me a lot lately, so I figure this is a good time to finally get the video done. For those of you who are new to the channel, this is basically just a test of your understanding of the rules, but instead of asking you questions from the rule book, it'll be like you're watching a real game being played, but periodically I just stop and ask legal or illegal, and your job is to figure out what you saw had been done correctly. Before we get started on the challenge, there are some things I should mention. First, I am using the optional political rule. That affects how some of the cards are handled during the politics phase. Now, I would normally stay away from variants in my videos, but I think this is such a standard change, and it's the way most people play the game now, so I think it would actually be more confusing to not use this new rule. If you're not familiar with the rule, it's in section 25 of the rule book, or at least newer versions of the rule book. And in fact, if you've played the game led by someone else, there's very good chance that's the way you think of as being the normal way to play the game. So maybe what you see here won't strike you as unusual anyway. Also, you'll see me using some red pawns during the video. They aren't part of the normal game, but I just find them useful as markers. Whenever a combat has been initiated, I put a pawn there just to make sure that I don't forget to resolve that combat. And I also use it as a marker to keep track on the politics board who's won the most recent combat. And also, because turns can be so long and complicated, I break up players' turns into phases. I won't necessarily show like all of France's turn at once. I'll show like the Czech supply phase, and then a separate question will be on their movement phase and the combat phase. So don't worry if you get to an end of a section and a player hasn't fully resolved their turn. As usual with my videos, we're starting well into the game. We've already played 1741 and 1742, so we'll be picking up the action in round 7 at the start of 1743. All right, since it's a new round, we need to do a politics phase, so we'll take care of that. We'll start by returning this face-down card to the Pragmatic Army, and we'll keep Austria's face-up card. We'll reveal 2 new politics cards. We have a red pawn here to indicate that the Pragmatic Army had the most recent victory, so they'll choose the suit, and they'll choose diamonds. Now players can play cards to the board. We'll start with Prussia, then France, Pragmatic Army, and Austria. We'll reveal those cards. Oops. We'll determine the order of influence. Looks like it's Austria, Prussia, France, Pragmatic Army. Austria will take a card, and they'll take Sweden surrenders and discard their cards from the board. And they'll declare that they're moving the Saxony marker to the right, but not moving the Russia marker to the left. The only remaining card to take, Prussia isn't eligible to take, so they're just going to conserve. Next up is France, and they will take the electoral Palatinate card, so they'll discard that, and they'll declare that they're executing the card. Next up is Pragmatic Army, but both cards have been selected, so we'll just flip over their card. Now players will execute the cards, so Austria will move the Saxony marker 1 space to the right. They'll ignore the Russia marker and discard it. And it looks like France is going to need to make some changes to the map. This card has 3 effects. First, it indicates that Mannheim becomes French-controlled, so we'll flip over the marker at Mannheim. And with that change, we'll flip the Mannheim Electoral College marker to the French side. The election's already been held, so I don't know if there's any value in continuing to maintain these markers, but it's something I commonly forget to do, so I try to stay in the habit. And I almost forgot, that gives France control of 3 of the 4 electoral fortresses. So we'll move a French victory marker from their pool to the electors box. The politics card also indicates that France should get 1 additional card and 3 additional troops. So we'll put a +1 marker on their card stack as a reminder, and they'll add 3 armies to their sheet. We'll discard this politics card, and that ends the politics phase. There are a few things worth pointing out here. Recall that Austria had saved a 7 of spades from the prior round, and then a pragmatic army had declared diamonds to be the trump suit, and then Austria added a diamond to that. And sometimes people aren't sure whether or not that 7 of spades should count since it isn't trump. But once it's been saved, it doesn't matter if it matches the new trump suit. So Austria was able to count the full 10 points here, not just the 3 of diamonds. And I think the thing people are most confused about during the politics phase is when you can conserve a card. It was legal that Prussia saved their card even though there wasn't a politics card that they were eligible to take at that time. In fact, in that situation, you're required to save your card. So Prussia didn't have the option of, say, taking that 10 of diamonds back into their hand. And note the difference between Prussia's situation and the pragmatic armies. Prussia didn't have a card they were eligible to take. When it was pragmatic army's turn, there weren't any politics cards left. So in the pragmatic army's case, they had to just flip over the card as if it had been a bluff. Now we're to the Hussars phase, and Austria is trying to block these 3 Prussian generals from reaching their supply train. To get in behind this general is 5 away from their Austrian generals, but luckily they have a Hussar that managed to survive that previous round, so they're just going to leave that one in place. And the other one they'll place right here, which is within 3 of this general. The Hussars phase is pretty simple, but it's worth pointing out that it was legal for Austria to leave in place a Hussar that was more than 4 spaces away from one of its generals. You can't place a new Hussar that way, but you're free to leave one where it is, regardless of how close your generals are to it. I also want to mention something that wasn't relevant to this example, but could come up later in the game. If Austria takes control of Saxony, they don't get to use that Saxony general for placing Hussars. It's exclusively the Austrian generals that determine where Hussars can go. Now we're on to France's action stage, and so we'll deal them new cards. They have this +1 marker, so we'll remove that, and instead of dealing them their normal 5, we'll deal them 6 new cards. And normally we would deal Bavaria 1 card, but currently Austria controls München, which is Bavaria's major fortress, so we won't give Bavaria any cards. Checking supply, 2 of France's generals are in their home country, so that's fine. This one here had been out of supply. It is now within 3 of its train, so we'll flip that over. Over on the Bohemia side, we have a Bavarian general in its home country. We have a French general within 4 of its train, and it can actually reach that train within 6, several routes. This general here is 7 away from its train, but it does have the Bavarian train just 4 away. So France won't flip any of these generals. Before we talk about what France did wrong, let's touch on a couple things that they did correctly, but people sometimes wonder about.
First, the fact that Bavaria did not get any cards this turn because they were not in control of München. I haven't run into this situation in many of the games I've played, so I tend to forget about this. But that's correct. And even if they're receiving subsidies from France, they wouldn't even receive those as long as they don't have control of München. And a couple things with this general tracing supply to its train. There's a couple different things here that people are unsure about. One is tracing through an enemy fortress to your train. That's legal. Also, tracing through an allied general to a train is legal as well. Now, what France did wrong was that its number 3 general was out of range to the French supply train, so they treated the Bavaria train as if it provided supply. But you can't do that. Even cooperating allies do not share supply trains. So France can't use Bavaria's train, and Bavaria can't use France's train. And the relationship's the same between Prussia and Saxony. But remember, there is one exception to this, and this is the Austrian General Ehrenberg. He can use the pragmatic army's trains. And note that I said Ehrenberg, not just Austrian generals. This is an ability limited to him personally. Now France can move and re-enter supply trains. We'll start with the Flanders map. Their number 1 general will just hold its position. Number 4 will move 3 spaces. 1, 2, 3. Their train will move 3 spaces on a main road. 1, 2, 3. Then the French number 5 general will do a forced march 6 spaces. They'll start in a elector fortress that they control. They'll go 1, 2, 3, past the Austrian train, 4, 5, past the Austrian controlled fortress, 6, and stop 2 spaces away from Ehrenberg. The problem this time was that the French general did a forced march adjacent to an Austrian train. Any adjacent enemy piece, whether it be a general or a train, blocks a forced march. Note though that an enemy fortress does not block a forced march, so it was fine that the general went past this space. Alright, now on to the Bohemia side. This general's already moved. The French number 2 general will move 2 spaces, 1, 2, adjacent to this Austrian general. They just left an Austrian fortress, so they'll place a provisional marker there. And I'm going to place a red pawn on there as a reminder for the upcoming combat. The number 3 general is going to move 3 spaces, 1, 2, 3. They pass through an Austrian fortress, so they'll place a provisional marker there. And there's going to be combat here, so I'll place another red pawn. The French train is going to move 2 spaces, 1, 2. The Bavarian general will move 3 spaces, 1, 2, entering this Austrian-controlled fortress, and 3. There's no Austrian general within range to defend that space, so we'll remove that victory marker and return it to the Austrian pool.
And we'll flip over the München Electoral College marker to reflect that change.
And finally, they'll move the Bavarian train 2 spaces, 1, 2. I've played Maria over 20 times, and I managed to make this mistake recently, so don't feel bad if you missed it. If a minor power loses control of one of its fortresses and then reconquers that fortress, you don't simply remove the enemy victory marker, you replace it with the major power's marker. So after the Austrian marker was returned to its pool, a French marker should have been placed there. You don't just clear the space and have it returned to Bavaria. France has 2 combats to resolve. They'll start with this one here. That'll be the French number 2 versus the Austrian number 3. Checking their sheets. They are both at 6, so that puts them at 0. So France will start. They're both in spades. France will play a 3 of spades, putting them up +3. And this will be painful for Austria, but they don't think they can afford to be spending any spade cards down here right now, so they are going to retreat. They're at -3, so they'll take 3 troops from their number 3 general. France will back them up 3 spaces. 1, 2, 3. And since they knocked out 3 Austrian troops, France will move a victory marker to the victory box. Now we'll resolve the other combat. Remove that pawn. And that'll be the French number 3 versus the Austrian number 2. Checking their sheets. France is at 5, Austria is at 4, so France is +1. Austria has the initiative at -1, and so they'll just take the retreat. They'll mark their sheet, losing 1 army. France will retreat this general 1 space to here. We'll now mark the retroactive conquest. There's no Austrian general within 3 of this space anymore, so we'll flip that over to France. This general is still within 3 and defending this fortress, so that'll go back to the French pool. We'll move the most recent victory marker from Pragmatic Army to France, and that ends France's turn. Something that happened this turn that tends to look illegal is that France had retreated this Austrian general adjacent to an enemy general. But that's fine, and it could even have been a French general that it was moved adjacent to. But remember that this does not cause another battle to occur. Now we're moving on to Prussia's action stage. We'll deal them their 3 new cards, and Saxony their 1 new card. Now Prussia will check supply. Their number 2 general is in good shape. I can easily trace 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to their supply train. And I don't know if you'll be able to clearly see it in the video, but there's actually 2 generals here, the 1 and the 3. It's pretty congested in here. I don't know if you can see all the cities clearly, but they're not going to be able to go around this way. That would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And coming around this side is going to lead them through Hussar no matter how they go. So it looks like both generals will have to pay a penalty. They're each tracing 5 spaces to supply through Hussar for a total of 10. They want to pay in hearts. The math doesn't perfectly work out, so instead of paying 10, they'll pay 11. Now discard those. And checking the Saxony general, he's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, so Prussia won't flip any of their generals. A question that is raised by this turn is that if 2 generals are affected by Hussars and have to pay tactical cards, are they resolved together or separately? And for the most part, they can be resolved together. As we saw in this case, Prussia had 2 generals affected, and instead of paying a card of at least 5 for one and then 5 for the other, they just combined it into a total of 10 and paid enough tactical cards to reach that level. So they happened to pay an 8 and a 3. Or they could have paid with just a single 10. An important caveat, though, is that they have to be generals of the same power. Here, it was 2 Prussian generals. If it's a mixed stack, say a Saxony general and a Prussian general, then those would have to be paid separately. The Saxony general from the Saxony cards, Prussian general from the Prussian cards. And something really basic I should mention, just because this does trip up new players sometimes. The cards that are paid for the Hussars aren't paid to Austria, they're just discarded. Now Prussia can move and re-enter supply trains. They'll move this stack of generals 1 space to here. That's going to cause combat with this Austrian stack, so I'm going to mark this with a pawn. They'll move their number 2 general 1, 2, and that's going to create combat here. They pass through an Austrian-controlled fortress, so they'll mark that with a provisional marker from their pool. They'll move their train 1, 2, and knock out this Hussar. The Saxon general will do a forced march. They'll go 1, 2, 3, into this French-controlled fortress. 4 pass their own train. 5, 6, 7, 8. And end adjacent to this Hussar. They'll move their train 1 space, and that ends their movement. This turn saw another forced march that I think would raise some doubts. For one, it was fine that Saxony passed through this French-controlled fortress. A fortress only blocks a forced march from entering it if it is enemy-controlled, and at this time France is still an ally of Saxony, so Saxony was able to pass right through there. It's also okay for a forced march to begin on an enemy-controlled fortress. You can't enter an enemy-controlled fortress on a forced march, but you can exit one. But as a result of that, you don't conquer it, whether it's defended or not. So even if there hadn't been an Austrian general within 3 of that fortress defending it, Saxony still wouldn't have conquered it. And I also want to point out the Hussar here. The Hussar is not technically an enemy piece, so even though it was adjacent to one of the spaces entered during the forced march, it did not prevent that. If there had been, say, an Austrian train here or an Austrian general, Saxony couldn't have entered this space on the forced march. Since it was just a Hussar, this was fine. And in fact, a Hussar wouldn't even block a forced march if it was sitting in the middle of the route. The general doing the forced march would just pass right through it and knock the Hussar off the board. Now Prussia has some combats to resolve. We'll start with this one. They'll remove their pawn, and this will be the Prussian 1 and 3 versus the Austria 1 and 4. We'll check their sheets, and Prussia is at 11, and Austria is at 5, so Prussia is +6. They're both in clubs. Austria is just going to try to get out of this as simply as possible. They'll play this 4 of clubs, which will put them at -2, and they'll retreat. They'll discard that card and mark the losses on their sheet. Their number 1 is at 4 armies, and their number 4 is at just 1 army. So they'll reallocate a couple of armies from the number 1 to the number 4, and then lose the 2 armies from the number 4. So that means the number 1 is now at 2 armies, and the number 4 is at 1 army. Prussia needs to retreat those generals 2 spaces, and they're going to split them up. They'll send the number 1 this way, 1, 2. And they'll send the number 4 this way, 1, 2. Now they'll resolve this combat. That Prussian general is at 4, and the Austrian general is at 3. So Prussia's at +1. Austria will accept the retreat. Prussia retreats them 1 space. They'll send them here. Austria will mark their sheet, reducing that general's armies from 3 to 2. There's still an Austrian general within 3 of this marker, so we'll return that to Prussia's pool. We'll move the most recent victory marker to Prussia. Prussia still controls Silesia, but they'll again choose to not offer peace to Austria. So that'll end their turn. The mistake here was the way Prussia retreated those stacked generals. When you retreat stacked generals, they have to remain stacked. You can't split them up. So either of these locations was fine, but wherever they ended up, they had to end up there together. Now it's time for the action stage for Austria and the Pragmatic Army. We'll deal 5 cards to Austria and 3 to the Pragmatic Army. We'll start out checking supply for the Pragmatic Army. Here's their supply train. This general is within 1, 2, 3 and can reach it through various routes. This one also is within 3. This general is 7 away. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 is his shortest route. But he is in Austrian territory, so the Pragmatic Army isn't going to flip any of these 3 generals. Austria's General Ehrenberg has actually moved to the Bohemia map, so we'll now check supply over there. Ehrenberg was in supply to this supply train, until the French general moved over here and cut him off. He doesn't have another supply train within reach, so Austria will flip him over. And that'll cause a loss of 1 army, so Austria will mark that on their sheet. Austria has 5 other generals, here, 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 and here. They're all within Austrian home country, so none of those will flip over. The mistake made this turn was the pragmatic army player treating Austrian home territory as if it's also pragmatic army home territory. It might be easy to overcomplicate the question of where a general is in supply, thinking that they're in supply in a cooperating ally's home country. But it's simple. A general is in supply in his home color. If he's not in his home color, he needs a supply train. Austria's General Ehrenberg is the only exception to this. He can be supplied by the pragmatic army train, and he's in supply in the pragmatic army's home country. Now, the one extra little twist to this rule is that the rule still does apply to Prussia, but after annexing Silesia, Silesia becomes home country for Prussia. Now, Austria and pragmatic army can move and re-enter supply trains. Theoretically, they're done simultaneously, but just for simplicity, I'll do all of pragmatic army and then Austria. Their general here will move 4 spaces on the main road, going 1, 2, 3, 4. There's no French general within 3 to defend this fortress, so we'll return that to the French pool. They'll move this train on the main road, 1, 2, 3. They'll do a forced march with this general, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and this is a number 3 and it's stacking with a number 2, so we'll put the number 2 on top. This general will move 3 spaces, 1, 2, 3. He started on this French-controlled fortress, so we'll mark that with a question mark from the pragmatic army's pool. He passed through this French-controlled elector fortress, so he'll mark this with a question mark from the supply, since that wouldn't get a victory marker from his pool. And then since there'll be combat here, we'll mark that with a pawn. Everything was done correctly, but there are a couple things I want to highlight. I might have made this one a little bit tricky with that earlier example where Bavaria had reconquered a fortress in its own territory, but was supposed to mark it with a French marker. And you might have thought, well, pragmatic army is a major power. Shouldn't they have marked this fortress with their own marker when they reconquered it from France? The difference is this was originally owned by Austria, which is a major power, not a minor power. So when it was reconquered by the pragmatic army, it just returned to Austria. The other thing I think is interesting from this turn is that a pragmatic army general force marched through a fortress space that had just been reconquered this same turn. I had to double check the timing of when fortresses are conquered. If a fortress is protected, it isn't fully conquered until after the combat phase. But if it's unprotected, like we had here, it is conquered immediately. So it was then legal for a pragmatic army general to force march right through that space. Now we'll do Austria's move and re-enter trains phase. They'll move their number 3 general 4 spaces on this major road. 1, 2, 3, 4. Passing through this French-controlled fortress that is not defended by a French piece. So they'll return that to the French pool. They'll move this general 3 spaces. 1, 2, 3. This one 2 spaces. 1, 2, and stack with that other one. That's a 2 stacking on top of a 4. They'll move this general 2 spaces, and that's going to create a combat here, so we'll mark that with a pawn. And we'll move this general 2 spaces, 1, 2, creating another combat. So we'll mark that. They'll move this train 2 spaces, 1, 2. Shifting focus a bit to the west, they'll move Ehrenberg 3 spaces on this major road, 1, 2, 3. They pass through a French-controlled fortress, but Ehrenberg is flipped, so they won't conquer that. And now they want to re-enter a train, but they don't have a 4 they want to give up, so they're going to spend this 5 of hearts. They'll remove their train here from the Flanders map and re-enter it in Prague, which they just reconquered. And to wrap up their movement, they'll move this train 2 spaces, 1, 2. I think the main thing from this turn that people might have been skeptical about was the way Austria handled that re-entry of the supply train. But they did everything correctly. They paid at least 4 points in cards. They took a supply train from on or off the map. Now, if they had had one off the map, naturally that would have been the choice, but it's fine to take one from a location on the map and re-enter it somewhere else. But most importantly, they did not move that train after they re-entered it. That's one I forget sometimes. I'll try to send a general racing out into enemy territory, thinking I will re-enter a train and move it closer to that general. But that train can't be moved until the next round. There's another thing I want to touch on, even though it didn't end up being relevant to this turn because this Saxony general had moved. But let's say this piece had stayed where it started the Prussian turn. This fortress was French controlled and this general was over here. When this general went through this fortress, that sometimes people are unsure whether that should be conquered, a French controlled fortress, when there's a Saxon or Prussian general within 3 of it. Keep in mind, though, that Prussia and France are just allies, not cooperating allies. They do not defend each other's fortresses. So even if this Saxony general had not moved, when that Austrian general passed through there, it still would have been reconquered. We still have to resolve some combat for both Austria and Pragmatic Army. By rule, we have to start with Austria, so let's go ahead and do that. We'll start here with this general and remove that pawn. That is Austria's number 1 general versus Prussia's number 1 and 3. Austria's general has 2 armies and Prussia's has 5 and 6, so it's 2 versus 11. So Austria is starting things out -9. Both sides are fighting in clubs. Austria will start things out with a 10 of clubs, putting them up +1. Prussia will play a 3, putting them up +2. Austria plays a 9, putting them up +7. Prussia plays a 10, up +3. Austria plays a 9, putting them up +6. The big guns are really coming out here. Prussia plays a 7, up 1. Austria plays a 4, they're at +3. Prussia plays a 6, they're at +3. Austria plays a 5, they're at +2. Prussia is going to play a reserve card, and they're going to make it an 8. So that puts them at +6. And Austria comes back with an 8, putting them up 2. Prussia's at -2, and they're going to decide to retreat. There are only 3 roads out of this space. 2 of them are blocked by Austrian generals. So the Austrian general will retreat this stack back to here. But there's a Prussian general. So they're just going to retreat the 1 general on top. And this other general they'll remove from the board. Now Prussia needs to mark the lost armies on its sheet. And that number 3 general had 6 armies. So instead of just losing 2 from that combat, they'll mark it down 6 armies lost. We'll mark those results in the victory boxes. Prussia ended up losing 6 armies in that combat. So we'll take 2 Austrian victory markers from their pool and put it in their boxes. And the 1 Prussian victory marker will return to the Prussian pool. We'll move the most recent victory marker from Prussia to Austria. And Prussia lost 6 armies in that combat, so we'll move the Saxony marker 2 spaces to the right. That has caused Saxony to go neutral, so now they'll resolve Saxony defects. They'll move the Saxony general back to its starting space here, and the Saxony train back to its starting space here. And Prussia will turn over the Saxony cards to Austria. To wrap things up, we'll get these cards out of here. And since these Prussian generals have moved, there won't be a combat here. We'll remove that, and that finishes Austria's combat. The mistake on this turn was that the Austria player put a general being retreated into a new stack. That's not allowed. Here's how the rulebook puts it. A retreating general may not enter or move through a city containing any other piece, enemy or friendly. Not even to eliminate a supply train, nor to stack with a friendly general. So the two generals that were here were pinned and had nowhere to retreat to, and so both should have been eliminated. The mistake with the retreat was so bad that it makes it awkward to talk about other aspects of the turn. We know that Prussia should have lost more than one general and 6 armies. But taking the way it was handled as a given, let's look at how they handled the victory boxes and the Saxony marker. The victory boxes were done correctly. Prussia lost 6 armies, so theoretically they lost 2 victory markers from their boxes, but they only had 1 to lose, so that they just lost that. That doesn't prevent Austria from gaining the 2 that they had earned. We don't have to have a zero sum here. Prussia loses 1, Austria gains 2, that's fine. The Saxony marker was also handled correctly. Now I could imagine a person thinking, well, Prussia only lost 1 victory box marker, so the Saxony marker should have only shifted 1 space to the right. But remember with the Saxony marker that you go by how many markers Prussia theoretically lost. Losing 6 armies, they theoretically lost 2 victory box markers, so Saxony shifted 2 to the right, not just 1. And if both Prussian generals had been eliminated as they should have been, Prussia would have lost 11 armies, and the marker then should have shifted 3 to the right. But always remember that shift due to Prussia losing victory box markers, that is optional for the Austrian player. I think in most circumstances they would accept the shift, but there may be strategic reasons that they would refuse it, and they're allowed to do that. Now the pragmatic armies combat needs to be resolved. They just have the 1 battle here. We'll remove that pawn. That'll be the pragmatics number 1 versus the French number 4. And that'll be 5 versus 3. So pragmatic army is +2. Both generals are in hearts. France has the initiative, so they will play an 8 of hearts, putting them at +6. Pragmatic will answer with a 9, putting them at +3. France will play a 4, +1. Pragmatic 6, +5. France 8, +3. Pragmatic army is going to try to get a big positive score here, so they're going to first play a 2. That puts them at -1. And then they'll play a 6, putting them at +5. France will play a 3, putting them at -2. And they'll play a 2, putting them at 0, shifting initiative back to pragmatic army. The pragmatic army is out of hearts. And they do have a reserve card, but they're going to choose not to play it. So the battle ends in a draw. We'll get these cards out of here. Both generals will stay in place. Since France was not retreated, both of these are still defended. So we'll return the one to the pool of the pragmatic army. And the other was from supply, marking an elector fortress. So we'll just return that to supply. That ends the turn and ends the round. We saw a couple of things during this combat that we haven't discussed yet. One was when France had played consecutive cards there at the end. And that's fine. Sometimes the power simply, does not have high enough value cards in the right suit to just, play one and have it switch the initiative.
Other times it may be because you deliberately play a low value card first so you can play a second card before the initiative switches to your opponent. And we saw a pragmatic army do that a little bit earlier in the combat. We also saw an example of cards being played to cause the number to be 0. And it was handled correctly here. The initiative switches to the other player, then that player must play a matching suit if they have one, or they may play a reserve card if they have one. Pragmatic Army happened to have a reserve card. They don't have to declare that, but they chose not to play it. At that point, the combat's over. There's truly no result, no winner, no loser, nobody's retreated, and so the generals finished the turn still adjacent to each other. All right, I'm going to wrap things up there. I hope you got something useful out of the video. If you think I got something wrong or just have a question, don't hesitate to leave a comment. Again, I'm Carter Maxwell. This has been Rules Challenge, and I hope to see you again soon. Thanks.